Well, we'd like to welcome you to another Sunday afternoon class from the BYU Library Family History Center, and we are going to talk about occupations are a key to unlocking missing ancestors. This is a topic that needs to become one of those foremost things that you think about, but often don't realize how important they are. One thing that is going to happen with the presentation today is that it is being recorded and will be made available on the BYU Library Family History Center website and on the BYU Library Family History Center YouTube channel. So either in both places, you'll be able to find these recorded presentations. Let's kind of get into this for a start here. The reason why this has become so important to view occupations as part of the information that goes along with researching families is that most names are not unique. There are possibly out there in the world some unique names or names that are so uncommon as to be almost unique. And a lot of names, particularly here in Utah, are made up names. I mean, they're names that didn't exist previously, and for a while they're probably unique, but many of them get borrowed and borrowed and borrowed, even though they were originally made up. Just kind of an indication here. We think of Smith name in English being a very common name, and one of the ways that I can tell that I have used in the past quite frequently is Find My Past, because I can basically put in a name and some just sort of general information. In this case, I'm looking in the world to see how many records there are, on the Find My Task website that have the same John Smith name. So when I do that, there are 3,498,971 results the last when I did this and preparing for this presentation. Just having done this same procedure using this program and others, I kind of have a feel for how frequent a name is going to be. And the purpose here, you can see very quickly that John Smith is going to come up in lots of different places and lots of different types of records, and it's going to be sometimes very difficult if that's all we have. And now what I'm suggesting here in this presentation is that we don't look at just John Smith, we look at John Smith and his occupation, or Jane Smith and her occupation, or whatever. So we want to avoid getting caught in the same name, same person trap. This is a screenshot from looking up a name in Family Search, and the name does not appear to be as common as John Smith, but on the other hand, William McDowell turns out a very common name. How many of these people are the same person is kind of be difficult to determine. If we look at these records, these four records that are showing, we'll see the first record shows up as a birth in Brooklyn. The second one is a birth in the United States. The dates are different. The third one that is a death record with a birth in 1878, which is different than the other two, and so forth. So as we go through here, the question is, how many of these are actually the same person? Are there some in there that are not, they're not the right numbers and the dates are wrong, or they're more than one person with the same name that have been merged, and things like that that can happen that would make this a little bit harder than it looks, especially if when you're starting out, you're not sure which of these different possibilities are the ones that you want to use for your person. You may have something that is different, slightly different than one or two of these people, but not knowing enough about the people to get going. In this case, there's other factors, and we could expand beyond occupations and say there's religion, there's other kinds of things that help us to differentiate between individuals with the same name. But in this case, occupation is one that appears quite frequently in records. And the examples that I'll be given are that in the British census records that start in 1841 up through every 10 years, there is an occupation given. In US Census records, there are occupations also. So it's something that, at least in the realm of the census years, is something that's rather straightforward and fairly easy to see. The problem, of course, is in some instances they're all farmers or they're all some other occupation, and it doesn't really help. But we'll get into that a little bit more because it's important that we understand that there's other reasons and other ways besides simply looking at a census record of determining what the person's occupation was. There's lots of other records that may mention the background of the person, including things like obituaries and other kinds of records. In some cases, the person's occupation may be a defining trait. In other words, if you're looking for this person and anything listed here, these are the A's and the number, different occupational things from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. Now, I'm going to mention too that I've put the URL, the address of all of these screenshots when it's appropriate for each of the screenshots on this particular presentation. And the presentation will be copied as a PDF file, the slides, and that will be the handout, which will be available on the BYU Library Family History Center website. So this is one way is to become familiar with the different kinds of occupations that are out there. So we need to watch for these records that have an occupation listed. You can see here in the United States Census, this is searching the 1880 census. One of the fields that Family Search has put on to allow a search of the 1880 census is occupation. So you could actually search by the occupation of your ancestor, even if you didn't know the person's name or their person's location at all. So if a person has a somewhat, unique occupation. Now, it may be also difficult at this point, it's important to note that you may have to think quite a bit and learn about the occupations to use the proper designation for the occupation. So there's a standard way of referring to people in the railroad industry or in the farming industry or whatever. And each of these people, each of these occupations may or may not be recorded correctly because a lot of the information comes from the people who are being, almost all the information in the censuses comes from the people who are responding to the census enumerators. And so they may or may not know the actual name of the occupation. I mean, they might say it's a store clerk, and that may not be helpful if there are 50 different types of store clerks in any one area. So that's another issue. So here's the form, and you can see that occupation is one of those standard things that we can look for. So we're now looking at the 1950 census. The 1950 census is the most recent census that we have available. And fortunately, even though there's been changes to the amount of information that's gathered in various census records, occupation is still a standard function of the census records. So we're looking here, and if we look very closely at this record, we see in the right side there's a list for occupations, and most of these people are listed as farmers, but there's also one that says that they are something that I can't quite read, car inspector for the railroad. So one of these people on here has an occupation that may be distinctive. In other words, you're going to be able to follow this person with that railroad occupation and separate that person out from all the background of farmers that were in the same area. There's also a section hand for the railroad. So in this particular census record, there are probably quite a few railroad workers. And that leads us to another part that I'll get to later in the presentation, and that is that using that information gives us opens a way to find out even more about this person and their family, and maybe break through a brick wall that may be in existence. So here's kind of a blow up of that portion showing the farmers and farming industry as the occupation for this quite, this number of people in this area. It's not surprising if we look at the place at the particular time in 1950 census, there was still a substantial percentage of the US population who were living on and working as farmers, which is not the case today. Now, let's say you get into older records and you start seeing occupations that look absolutely like wouldn't they be able to even guess what that is? And that it can be the case, particularly as you're doing research in countries like another country outside of the United States. And even within the United States, there may be specialized occupations that you would not recognize what they did for their living as a person. So just to know this, that there are both books and online resources that give you long lists of genealogy archaic terms. And a lot of those have to do with old occupations. And so there's going to be a way to look up this information. Today, though, rather than being solely confined to these books and websites, you can really just ask one of the chatbots, Gemini or Copilot or ChatGPT or Claude or one of these other chatbots, if they happen to know this, the chatbot happens to know what this old occupation name is and what they did. And you can ask that question. I might suggest if you do that and they give you an answer that you then check that back to see if that is a consistent answer with what other sources may show for that same information. Not that we don't trust chatbots, we just don't trust chatbots. Okay. Research into occupations may ultimately lead you to on-site physical research in archives, libraries, special collections, hospitals, historical societies, and other repositories. So how does this come about? Well, we find out that we have this person and and the only thing we know about them now is that he was a pullman for a railroad, or he was some other sort of vague or probably very not too unique, but certainly not common occupation. And we want to find out more about that person and his occupation. Well, using the occupation as a jumping off point gives us opportunities to look for records that deal with those specific occupations. And as I go through this presentation, I'm going to show how we can go from a name of the occupation and then find out more information and maybe find out even a lot more information about our individual as he was or she was recorded in their in the documents having to do with that particular occupation. So is the way it is that we do in doing research in genealogy, we find that any piece of information that we find about the individual or a family can then be suggestive of additional records that might reflect more information about that individual or the family. It's just like, and a good example is if we find a death record and a cemetery record, for example, a tombstone, or whatever about a person. That opens up a whole long list of other possible record sources, from mortuaries to the burial procedures in the particular cemetery to newspaper articles to lots of other associated records. So part of the process of expanding your ability to do genealogical research is in acquiring enough information to begin to associate the specific information that you find into general searches of additional information that may be available as a result of the information that's been provided. And occupation is always that case. No matter what the occupation is, it's almost inevitable, at least to the point where I've not ever found an exception, that there will be additional information that we can find and records that might be applicable. And I'll talk about more of that as we go along. So I'll start out here first with railroads. Railroads played an important part in the United States in from employment. And the fact that you find somebody as a railroad worker may or may not be helpful unless you can find out more information about the person. And so one of the things that you can find, and this is just an example of a record, this is from the National Archives in Atlanta. So it's the Atlanta branch of the National Archives. And in this case, there are Railroad Retirement Board records. And it's interesting from this National Archives view. You may think, well, yeah, but I've never seen a Railroad Retirement Board record and I wouldn't know where to find it. And the answer is, well, they're sitting in the archives, in National Archives. In this case, reading this print here, the lower print, it states that the National Archives at Atlanta has received approximately 54,000 cubic feet of Railroad Retirement Board inactive claim folders from the National Archives Great Lakes region. This is just one regional area of the United States, and it's only one type of record. And the Railroad Archive, the National Archives in Atlanta, has 54,000 cubic feet. Just kind of visualize that of the number of records that may be contained that way. And there's an interesting sidelight here because the National Archives, in many cases, will tell you how many cubic feet of records they have. They don't tell you how many individual records there are. And there may be 500,000 records in there. There could be that many, 54,000 cubic feet. We don't know how long each one of the folders were. We have no idea how many records are actually in this collection. And the only thing we can do here is to then take the opportunity to either go to Atlanta or National Archives or contact and determine more or do some more research to figure out what's contained in all those records. And there's more information here given about the records themselves that rather than just what I've copied through this screenshot. So the question here is, aren't we just becoming overwhelmed with all of this extra information that's out there? And I guess what I would have to say about getting involved, very, very considerably involved, like I have been for almost half, well, actually a little over half of my life. I have obviously found that these kinds of records can be found, that they're not always at the only place in the National Archives, that somebody else may have already created an index to these records or has digitized the records or made some way that they're now becoming more available. On the other hand, as I pointed out just a few minutes ago, it may be necessary to physically go search the records that are available. And it also depends on your degree of, let's call it, just your availability of time and effort and your desire to find the information for an individual person or a group of people or a family of people or more than one person at a time. So this is just a way of showing that working through the records and finding out the person's occupation automatically gives us additional records and additional paths for research. Whether we take those paths and whether we do the research, it depends on our sense of priority, time, and also perhaps the backing that we have enough resources ourselves to spend time to look at one of these sets of records. Going on with railroads, here's now the general National Archives. And the number one thing is says visit the National Archives catalog. Okay, now this is kind of a road sign on the road to your research here that oh, well, maybe we should look in the catalog and see if there's anything that would specifically help us to either find records about a particular person, or if their records are just are so generalized that they don't have that level of information. They don't keep track of individuals. These are all records about the operation of the railroad. Or these records are, yes, they're all personnel records, and yes, you would have to search through them by date and then by location. And that may be possible with some of these records. And perhaps you have to learn where the records were kept by the agency, like in this case, the United States Railroad Administration, how they kept their records and what kinds of records were kept. Some of that information is going to be available right here on the National Archives website. Other parts of that information might only be available by researching the United States Railroad Administration directly as for information about what kinds of records were kept. And from the greater standpoint, for example, I just happen to know this because I've done a lot of the extensive research, is that my ancestors, my direct line ancestors in the Tanner family go back to my great grandfather, much further than that. But my great grandfather, who lived in northern Arizona and was a pioneer, Arizona pioneer, and they arrived in that part of what's called the Little Colorado River Colony in 1878. And only a few years later, by 1862, and beginning in 62 and extending to 64, the railroad came through, right through the town, right through the middle of the town. So the railroad, obviously, they were no longer on the edge of civilization. They were no longer pioneers out in the wilderness. They actually lived in a railroad town. And many of the children of that family, of my aunts and uncles, were hired by the railroads for a period of time. So there's the information, like that information basically says, well, maybe there's a railroad record of them working for the railroad. Maybe that will tell me more information about this person than I knew before. And that would all depend on how much information I'm really trying to acquire. If I'm doing a book about my ancestor, if I were writing a book about his ancestor, the railroad records would be one of the records I'd want to look at, because I would want to know exactly when the rails reached a point of time, a place where they could have used the railroad to travel to other parts of the country, and also what impact the railroad might have had on the people that were living in this small isolated community, or previously isolated community, which, by the way, is now on the freeway and the railroad, the interstate freeway. So this is one consideration. Now I'm still on railroads, by the way, and I'm not. There's no way in the world I can talk about all the different types of railroad records and all the different railroads and all the various time uh, frames for each of the railroad properties. So what we're looking at here is another set of records. These come from the Library of Congress. I was thinking the other day that I think there's a little bit of of confusion sometimes in researchers. They hear the Library of Congress is this huge library and has all these records. The National Archives is this National Archives of the United States, and it has all these records. So what's the difference between the two? Don't they kind of overlap? The answer is not really. They don't really overlap. They are, in a sense, completely different. This is the Library of Congress. That's what it is. So these records are created and gathered specifically to support the Congress of the United States. That doesn't mean that they haven't acquired other records which aren't directly related to congressional activities. The National Archives, is much broader. National Archives is their object is to preserve virtually everything. So almost everything else ends up in the National Archives. But here you can see that these are online resources listed by the Library of Congress that are not necessarily anything to do with the National Archives. So this is a long list of research collections about railroads. The next thing is just to give you an idea of how long the list is. So I made a little listing video here showing all the different archives and online places where you might start to look for information about all of the railroads properties, all the railroads. And I quit. Obviously, I have to admit, I stopped the video before I went through the entire list. So that gives you kind of an opening into the large world of railroad records and how much impact that could have. You might think, well, my people never had anything to do with the railroad. Well, you may be surprised. And it would always be a good idea when you were looking at somebody who lived in any one of the states of the country is to see how close they lived to the railroad and whether or not working for the railroad was an option. And looking at the census records, you may see that they say they're some kind of railroad person, like the ones we looked at initially here. Now here's a whole set of records. This is the Newberry, which is a huge library in Chicago. And the Pullman Company was the company that had a lot of railroad employees. And many of the people who worked for the Pullman Company were African Americans. That was a one kind of outlet that was what it became possible for a fairly substantial number of African Americans to get employment outside of just being laborers and farmhands and being employed at very low entry jobs. And the Pullman employees actually made enough money that it raised the standard of living considerably. And it became a great way for people also to, through their connections with the railroad, to enable millions of people, literally millions of African Americans, to move out of the southern states and into various parts of the country. And so these records are very important. And as we go along, you can see that first collection is only one of the collections. And you can also see that the Pullman Company did not hire just African Americans. They hired practically anyone who could get a job there. And this one here is the company that made the cars. And so this is the factory in Chicago that was the factory where the cars were made. So this kind of a spin-off of the railroad records and to the people who were employed in providing all the services that went along with the railroad, the telegraph operators, all of the all the people who laid the rails, all the people who maintained the rails system, all the people who worked in the offices and and the tickets and all of that ticketing and all of the accounting and everything. So there's additional occupations there that can help to identify and give specific information about a person. Now we're going to switch sides here quite quickly. We're going to go to an entirely different area. And as I mentioned, that farming was the predominant occupation of people in the in America here in the colonial times and up until the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the mid 1800s and until going into the 1900s. Farming was always a very, very, very important a part of employment scene in the United States. So how do you begin to differentiate people as all these different farmers? Well, it becomes interesting because there are, in this case, records that come about as a result of what's called the cooperative movement among farmers. And what the farmers learned in the United States very quickly was that if they tried to farm their land and then sell the produce from their land, whether it be wheat or corn or soybeans or whatever, rice or whatever it was they were growing, then it was very difficult for them to get a good price because everybody had to build their own structure for storing and transporting the say corn. So basically, groups of farmers would form a co-op, and the co-op would then, based on the percentage, they would build the silos. They would take over the occupation of selling the grain and getting a price for it. And it became such that commodities such as corn and wheat and other grains and other products began to have national pricing. So, in other words, there was a grain market. The grain market would establish how much the grain was being sold for. The co-ops enabled each of the individuals, farmers, to leverage their farming with a group of individuals who could negotiate prices and store grain and sell the grain at a time when it was more advantageous to get some money. So, what's the reason for this? Well, because farm co-ops kept records. In this case, this is a collection that happens to be at the Utah State University Special Collections and Archive Library Division in the Utah State University in Logan, Utah. And there are 5 boxes, 2 linear feet of farmer grain cooperative records from 1974 to 1992. It's just an example of one set of records. One time, as I was doing some research in connection with articles for the Family Search Research Wiki, I dug into Utah as far as farming and agricultural co-ops and organizations were concerned and found a list of local co-ops and organizations in the state of Utah that took up 2 pages, single space, of all the different organizations. And the question, of course, is what kind of genealogical information can you get from this? And the answer may be the crucial information that you needed to know to differentiate and establish your person's farm and when they had it and what they produced and who was employed and what were the connections they had, who were their neighbors, what happened what was their extended family like. So the more information you're able to find about the individuals is always useful in expanding the other possibilities that you have for finding out information about the family. Now, if you're stuck on birth, death, and marriage records, you might even find that here in the cooperative records because they may have recorded when a certain person died and the name of the heirs of the person who then took over their position in the cooperative. So this is, you wouldn't be surprised if there's records here that would be helpful in that regard also. So basically, you just search for a cooperative in the place where the farm was located. There's undoubtedly, uh, because of the nature of farming in the United States, working into the latter part of the mid part, and even earlier in the 1800s into the early 1900s, you're going to find that almost all farmers belong to some kind of a cooperative if they were in the business of raising a cash crop. So now we're going to kind of jump sideways, and that is we go into another occupation, and that's insurance, and the people involved in the insurance industry. And yes, there are insurance industry records, and yes, you can look up and find out about a person through their insurance and their insurance records to the extent that they've been preserved. But this is a set of maps called the Sanborn Insurance Maps, and they extend over most of the United States during the late 1800s into the early 1900s and later. And the purpose of these maps was to provide detailed information about every structure, the buildings in every community. So stretching across mostly the U.S., the Midwest of the United States and into other parts of the country. Sanborn did a detailed map of each town, and maybe sometimes different copies, later copies and updates and things. But in each case, they named every single person who was involved in that town. Now, here's just one pulled up. I just needed an example, and this is the one that came up. This is in Lucerne County, and it is the map of the town. And as you kind of get in here, then all of a sudden you're seeing there's a connection here to occupations. If you realize that U.S. Census records allow you to locate the house, the dwelling, where the people, whether it was an apartment or whether it was a standalone house or whatever it was, a row house or whatever, the census record will allow you to discover which one specific house was where your ancestors in the census lived. And if you go to these maps, you can pull up that location and you can start to see whether or not they were associated with a particular occupation here. And you can see that just in this small town, there were a lot of what today would be not be occupations that would be current, but there are lots of them here that are still the kinds of occupations that people could have today. This is another way to get into that area of beginning to understand what job they may have had. And it would also give you specific names and places for the companies that were hiring the people, and you can then start looking for records for the companies, and maybe their records of their corporation and their people who are involved are still available and available in some other collection. Usually, in this case, they would be probably in a special collections library of a university that was interested in the records from this particular area. So these are another kind of map, and these look similar to the Sanborn maps, but these are for an entirely different reason. And these are cadastral maps, and cadastral maps were created for tax purposes primarily. This is a way by which counties calculated the tax that each individual property was going to be assessed with. Now, taxes and the property ownership are very closely related, and both of them help you talk about the movement. Let's say your person is in Iowa and all of a sudden disappears. Well, they could have died. But if we look through the tax records, we may find out that there was some other disposition. They sold the farm. They're no longer the owner of the farm or whatever. In this case, the cadastral records get down to, as you can see on the left here, kind of a blow up of the bigger map. and that is that every property has the name of the then owner of the property. And so, in another way, if you find out that your family lived in Ashland County, Ohio, and you want to know down to the actual street where your ancestor had their business or their home, then you can do that with these cadastral maps. They're very, very detailed. Now, one other area that we could get into, of course, once we get into people who were involved in, and working in manufacturing primarily, or other like agricultural workers and whatever, during most of the early 1800s and into the early 1900s, labor unions were the big deal. And they still are in the United States. But for reasons, for example, now that most of the farming done in the United States is done by farming giant farm companies, agricultural companies. The home farm is in a very small percentage of what's left. If there's anything like organizations of any type, unions are one of those types of organizations, and there's union records. And also, they have records of all of the people who were part of the union. And where would you find these records? Well, this is exactly what this Library of Congress archival collection tells you, that these are various different kinds of records that are available. The other places that you look for are the places that you find archives. There's state archives, there's state historical societies and organizations, there's university special collections. All of these different kinds of things are ones that you could that basically may have these kinds of records. So this is Cornell University's, and they've done this digital labor collections. In other words, here are the labor and union records and a lot of the different kinds of things like the AFL-CIO and all of that. And here are links to those collections of records. When we get into this kind of point here, it's important to note that when we talk about genealogical research, we seem to focus on records that we identify as being genealogy records. And they're very limiting, because if you're just looking at things that have already been identified as genealogy records, you're probably missing the vast bulk of records that are available. And here you can see from the categories here from Cornell University, there's garment and textiles, there's railroads, there's miners and mining, there's collective bargaining agreements, there's strikes, there's Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire records, there's all sorts of things in here. And a lot of this information is now available online in some format, but not necessarily available through the genealogical websites. This is, now we're still talking about labor, but now we're getting into the Society of American Archivists, and what they have done is get the labor archives. So here's a United States and Canadian directory of archives where labor records are kept. And it's possible to get into these types of records for doing research about individuals and their participation in, or their whatever they are. And if you're writing a history of your ancestor, and or you wanted to know more information about your ancestor, you may find out your ancestor was involved in a union movement and either benefited or suffered the consequences of their advocacy of a union. My grandfather, my maternal grandfather, was a newspaperman, and he had a good job for the newspaper in Salt Lake City, the Deseret News, and he also worked on the Tribune, the two newspapers. Unfortunately, he got involved, or fortunately for him, but unfortunately for his job, he got involved with labor unions and he got fired. And eventually, he had to move to California and get a job to get out of the fact that nobody would hire him in Utah, probably. That's my supposition, but what happened was that he lost his job in Utah and had to move to California. So now we're going to get into just general types of collections that we might find. We have New Mexico Farm and Ranch Heritage Museum, 6,000 cataloged items of New Mexico Farm and Ranch. I'm throwing these out as examples of places where you can look and possibly find the information that you haven't been able to find years and years ago. And next, the last one is one of my favorites. And this goes back, by the way, animals have been branded, farm animals have been branded for, historic, clear back 1,000 years or more. But most people don't understand the importance of the brand. And the brands that they had and livestock brands were actually registered in a lot of cases, and they're inheritable, they're personal property. So the Landstark brand, and it turns out that women, because the men died, leaving their wives, this property became the property of the surviving spouse. And it's very possible, and has been a good source of finding out the maiden name of the spouse of the woman. And one of the first things you're going to find in early colonial records from dating from the time of the Mayflowers are the brand registrations. So just understand that this is something that's a common thing that's just stands up till the present day. Right here, for example, History of Arizona Livestock Brands by the Arizona Department of Agriculture. So getting into this, you may be able to untangle some of the things that happened with your ancestors and their ranches across the country. And I'm just going to throw in some more here. There's research, law enforcement records. You have Department of Justice, FBI, Alien, all sorts of other records that may show up as having need. And last but not least is American Beekeeping Federation records. So right now you're going to find a set of records being kept on an online archive of California for beekeeping. And you might do this across the country. So there's another source of records for information. Oh, yeah. Don't forget the guys who are professionals. There's lawyers, there's doctors, there's accountants, there's the other professional people. And yeah, they're all recorded and they're all listed in there and they're going to show up in the histories. And that's very sure. Just throwing in something else. How about some dental records, client dental records? I think that might help you. Okay. So keep looking and you'll keep finding more records. Thanks for watching. Any quick questions we have here?
Yeah, James, we have a question from Lee. Are union guilds and other established trade organizations likely to keep records helpful for genealogy research?
Okay, so all records is I guess if you haven't gotten the point here, I think every record can be called a genealogy record because the point that sometimes we have to do to find our person is to identify the person from a record that establishes his or her existence at a specific place and time. So any records that can do that, and the answer is yes. Almost any record you can find that potentially could name your person may open up the door to you to resolve exactly where that person was at a specific point on the face of the earth in a specific time. And then records can then just sort of flow from that point in time. And these are just all records that would help to do that and may very well have more information than you were aware of previously.
Okay, one other quick question on that is this is Lee again saying he enjoys looking at the occupation and employers of the U.S. World War II draft registration cards. Since not everyone who registered served, how their occupation point us towards other sources about their life.
Okay, so I was once given a challenge by one of my friends who came to me with a photo and said, all I know is that's my grandmother and her name was this. And the people in the photo, I assume, were her children. I do not know anything about my grandmother. My father and my mother were divorced. This is my mother's mother, and I don't have any idea who these people were. And all he had was one photograph. We took her name and the photograph and eventually found the names of her children because it was just a census record issue. And then one of the people we found had filled out a draft registration record and put down their employer, and it was in California. And we were able to trace the family to the area of Sacramento, California. And then we discovered that they had to go back. They were getting married in Los Angeles, in north of Los Angeles, along the coast between and they were basically Catholics, and they had been married in the missions. And with that, we were able to find the mission records, and by using their occupation, we knew we had traced them all the way back to where they got married, and then their family was right there in the Catholic Church mission records. So I mean, this occupation thing is just one step. It's something that gives you a point to begin looking for additional records many times.